Good evening and welcome to this evening's roundtable featuring the deans of 4 of our region's leading schools of architecture and planning. The Dallas Architecture Forum is pleased to partner with University of Texas at Arlington, CAPPA, in organizing and presenting tonight's program. I think will be very interesting and important for us here in the state of Texas. On behalf of the forum and CAPPA, we welcome each of you to this evening's program. My name is Nate Udaley, the director of the Dallas Architecture Forum. The forum is a community for everyone who wants to learn about and improve the urban fabric of North Texas. It's architecture, design, landscape architecture, and public places. The forum also educates about key topics relating to planning and the built environment that impact us both locally and globally. We're grateful for our members, and we invite you, if you're not a member, to join the forum at our website, dallasarchitectureforum.org. We also encourage you to follow the forum and CAPPA on social media. The forum thanks our donors, members, and sponsors for their financial support that make events such as this possible. We want to give special recognition to our outstanding sponsors who made this evening's roundtable a reality. The forum is grateful for our seasoned sponsors, Faisal Haloum Group, Briggs Freeman Sotheby's International Realty, Reggie Graham, Maharger Development, and SMEEK for their leadership support. We're also thankful for our series sponsors, DLR Group, Stoffelbach, HKS, Jackson Walker, O'Brien Architects, and Scott and Reed. Our lecture sponsors for this evening are Boca Powell and Perkins and Will, and our reception sponsors for the evening are Diana and Frank Aldridge, Corgan, and the Beck Group. Please join me in thanking all of our sponsors. The forum will present 2 more outstanding lectures this spring. Our next lecture will be with the acclaimed architect Sebastian Schmaling on Wednesday, April 17th. His award-winning residential and multifamily projects are amazing, and you'll want to join us at the Angelica Theater in Mockingbird Station for what will be, I think, a fantastic evening. Again, that's on April 17th, 7 p.m., reception at 6:15. And then our final lecture for the spring season will present Interior Design Hall of Fame and Architectural Digest 100 honorees Calvin Sow and Zach McCown. Internationally recognized for projects that range in scale from very small product design to amazing residences to urban plans around the world and in China. They'll speak for us back here at the Horchow DMA on Wednesday, May the 1st. It'll be a fantastic way to close our 2018-2019 lecture season. The forum will present 2 more important panel discussions this spring. On Tuesday, April 23rd, we look at the impact of deck parks in Dallas and the connected parks. Overall, I think people would say Clyde Warden's been amazing. Looking at the addition, looking at the park by the zoo, and also looking at connected parks, there's issues with equity and things. So we want to kind of look at the whole panorama of that topic. So that again will be on Tuesday, April 23rd. And that panel will be at the Dallas Black Dance Theater. It's free, open to the public. The panel's at 6:30 with drinks at 6:15. And then the forum is launching a series over the next couple of years of panel discussions on the issues of housing in Dallas, focusing on issues of accessibility and affordability. Dallas is growing rapidly, but it's creating a lot of issues for people who want to live here. The first panel will look at the historic context of how we've kind of gotten to where we are, and we'll also look at the comprehensive housing plan that was adopted by the city of Dallas about a year ago. Again, this panel is free to the public, and we invite you to join us on Thursday, May the 9th, for this important topic. Again, the Dallas Black Dance Theater, complimentary drinks at 6:15. Program starts at 6:30. And now I'm very pleased to introduce our collaborator and partner for the evening, Brad Bell, who's the director of the School of Architecture at UTA CAPPA, and is also the chair of the lecture programming committee for the forum. He'll introduce our moderator and our 4 distinguished panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nate. Thank you for your continued leadership at the forum. As Nate mentioned, it's my distinct honor to be here tonight and to introduce our guests and the moderator. As we started talking about this program over a year ago, we were excited to put this together on several fronts. One, it's a recognition that in many ways the idea of the dialogue has a rich place in this kind of context, right? We're able to bring together thought leaders and to hear from them in terms of being able to talk with each other and to talk with you. So I look forward tonight to hear from them in this platform in terms of where we see academia and the profession heading within our state. Second, the institutions that are represented here tonight really represent the majority of the workforce that will lead into the future in our state. And so in that regard, we have a unique opportunity to hear from those that are educating within architecture, landscape, and planning, what it means to see a glimpse of what the educational platform will mean for where that's headed in the next decade. And third, the broader diversification of thought, organization, pedagogy. These are really taking hold, I think, within academia, but certainly within our state as well. Over the last several years, there's been a lot of change in the leadership positions within the majority of the academic institutions of colleges and schools of architecture, planning and landscape, construction, and it's certainly true that that's taken hold within the institutions that are represented here tonight. And in that regard, I think we're going to have a unique opportunity to hear about the way in which the built environment will be transformed through the leadership that's starting within these schools, within these institutions. With that, it's my unique and fortunate opportunity to be able to introduce the panelists that will be here. And so with that, I'd like to invite them to the stage as I then have the chance to introduce them. So starting on the right, Michelle Addington, Dean, School of Architecture at the University of Texas at Austin. Michelle Addington is the Dean at the School of Architecture at the University of Texas at Austin, where she holds the Henry M. Rockwell Chair of Architecture. And she was formerly she held the chair in Sustainable Architecture of Design at the Yale University School of Architecture and was jointly appointed as a professor at Yale University School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. She was educated as a mechanical engineer and as an architect. She focuses on advanced technologies, energy, and new materials. To her left is Dean Adrian Parr, the Dean of CAPPA at the University of Texas at Arlington. Adrian Parr is the Dean of the College of Architecture, Planning, and Public Affairs. She holds the UNESCO Chair of Water and Human Settlements and is a transdisciplinary scholar working on the intersection of architecture, criticism, aesthetics, political theory, and environmental studies. She's published 8 books, and the most recent being a trilogy on environmental politics and sustainability culture. She produced and co-directed the award-winning documentary, The Intimate Realities of Water, which chronicles the complex relationships between water, gender, sanitation, and development in Nairobi's shantytowns. And then to her left is Dr. Jorge Vanegas, the Dean at the College of Architecture at Texas A&M. Dr. Vanegas has been there since July 2008 and is a research professor at the Texas Engineering Experiment Station. His scholarly and professional activities include creativity, innovation, design, and entrepreneurship, built environment sustainability, and integrated AEC capital, asset delivery, and management. He holds a bachelor's degree in architecture from the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, Colombia, and a master's of science and doctorate degrees in construction engineering and management from the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Stanford University. And then to his left is James Williamson, Dean at the College of Architecture at Texas Tech University. James Williamson received his Master's of Architecture at Cranbrook Academy of Art under Daniel Libeskind and studied in the graduate program in the History and Theory of Architecture at the Architectural Association in London. Williamson is taught at Cornell as director of the Master's and Bachelor's in Architecture program, also at Harvard and the Georgia Institute of Technology, the Rhode Island School of Design, Rice University, the Cooper Union, Columbia University, and also at the University of Texas at Austin. Jim is now the Dean of the College of Architecture at Texas Tech, where he is revamping the curriculum, coordinating a new university-wide effort for Marfa, Texas, and leading the effort for a new building for the College of Architecture. Joining them is our moderator, Mark Lamster. Mark is the award-winning architecture critic for the Dallas Morning News, a professor of architecture at the school at the University of Texas at Arlington, and a Loeb Fellow at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. His acclaimed biography of the late architect Philip Johnson, entitled The Man in the Glass House, was published in November of 2008 by Little Brown. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed guest tonight.
School dean, so I wore my cowboy boots. I'm glad you're all here, showing that you do care about our future and our children. Actually, I think it's really exciting to have these deans, because I think so much of the architectural profession is educated in Dallas anyway, is educated in state. So maybe we could have a round of applause from everybody here who is an alumni or a student at one of these 4 schools to get an idea of who's here. Listen to that. All right. Okay, with no further ado, I guess we should get things started. So I guess my first question will be to you, Adrian. Adrian is my boss and my dean. So my question to you is, obviously you're the best dean here. Is it hard to be so great? No, don't answer that.
We're making things great again, right?
Yeah. Oh my God, no, sorry.
You opened it up.
April Fool's Day was yesterday. In all seriousness, I think it's exciting to have 2 female deans on this panel, which would not have happened not too long ago. And I think there's been a sort of a rise of the lady dean. So many of the leading architecture schools in the country, including yours, are of your gender now. God, this is awkward. Princeton, Yale, Cornell, Rice.
Berkeley.
Exactly, lots. So it seems like women are doing well in the dean field. But I think we're still having problems promoting women in the profession and reaching equity in the profession, gender equity in the profession. So I guess from your perspective, and maybe you could both answer this, and you as well, is like, what can schools do to help try and improve this situation? Obviously, because it's a dire one.
In terms of gender equity in the school, it's fairly equal, right, in terms of the students. But when we're looking at the makeup of professors, or at least in our school, amongst the tenure track faculty, it's still not very equal. However, I would like to add the way in which I think about diversity is not just along gender lines. I think we need to be more attentive to the different ways in which diversity operates, and thinking about the Latino community, African American communities, and how might they also be represented throughout the teaching body in the universities. And it's in my view, it's not a matter of saying, okay, let's tick that box. We've filled that spot with someone from that particular background. I think we need to think more holistically about even the ways in which we construe the positions that we're seeking in the future to fill tenure track spots. For example, understanding that people from different kinds of backgrounds bring different sorts of research interests and skill sets to the table, and how might we as a community begin to identify what those are and produce a more welcoming environment for research that's done by people from a variety of different underrepresented backgrounds from within academia and architecture. What do you think, Michelle?
Well, this is interesting because last night I spoke on a bit about this topic we opened an exhibition at the school to honor John Chase. For those of you who don't recognize the name, John Chase was the first African-American architect who was licensed to practice architecture in the state of Texas, the founder of the National Organization of Minority Architects. And in preparing my comments for that, one of the things that I referred to was something that I had witnessed a number of years ago when a group of students complained, not at UT, not in Texas, but at a different place, Northeast, Parr, that they had been
Much
given,
colder.
yeah, much colder, that they had been given a list of precedent architects that had made really shaped the way that we thought about architecture in the 20th century, and that every one of the architects was a white male from either Europe or the United States. And the students had pushed back, why no people of color? Why no women? Why no Latin Americans? Why no Asians? Why no Africans? They really didn't care that much about Canadians or Australians, who weren't included within that either. But they were focused on that, and the response was that these are the people who made a difference in the way that we think about architecture. They determine the canon of architecture. This is who influences the way that we think about architecture. And what I think I realized when I heard this was that, we actually were only paying attention to a very small group of people. And when we begin to circumscribe what we think is important, how we define a profession based on a very sort of narrow group that we listen to, it continues to reinforce itself. So there will always be outsiders in that. So I think that we're at this time within our set of fields that we're really questioning how it is that we identify what we consider to be the canon, the theory of architecture, at the same time recognizing how many voices have simply been excluded from that. And has that exclusion actually made our field smaller? The more exclusive it's been, the more it ends up being excluded from being part of the larger discourse about what's going on. So I think it's not just about thinking, yes, we need to increase numbers. We also need very much to start sort of like paying attention to more voices, being more receptive to these other voices and what they represent in the field at large.
Yeah, and ultimately I think it comes down to sort of how you frame the question too. Not about, in my view, who or what is represented, but how does representation work, right? And I think that's sort of what you're alluding to there.
Do the guys get to answer?
Just a few days ago, I was at a day-long session at Texas Tech on the subject of diversity. And one of the points that seems to be the most difficult to have accepted is that diversity is not a politically correct movement, and it's not only something that might have to do with practicality, but it's actually connected very closely with the notion of excellence. Multiple voices ultimately raise the bar rather than what lower it, which many people think. Architecture, like almost any form of knowledge, can be a closed system. And as a closed system, it has its inbuilt prejudices. And the idea, I think the important goal is to break down the barriers within that closed system. We may not realize it's been a closed system, but clearly it has. At Tech, we have our own challenges relative to this. We're right now probably at 44-45% of our student body being Hispanic. So we're looking for diversity in other ways, in terms of gender, in terms of international exposure, in terms of people of other ethnic backgrounds. That's our challenge. Women are also a challenge, and I think that gender challenge is particularly unique, and it's something I didn't quite experience until I came here. Where I've been, I've spent a long time, I was raised in Texas. I grew up in Richardson, by the way. I was away from Texas for 35 years, and I was in charge of admissions processes, where if you could easily fill a freshman class with 75% women. It would be very, very easy to do that. The perceptual prejudices were not there in the Northeast the way that they are here. Now, it could be that that was a much more internationally based program, but I think we have to make real efforts to communicate what architecture is to a much broader set of people. The perceptions of what architecture is, its technical basis, all of this, which tends to discourage any number of people, are not necessarily true or valid or supportable. We have to do a much better job of communicating what we do.
My answer is going to be a little bit on the short side. As a Hispanic, by whatever definition it is, I became very aware when I came to this country, having been born in Colombia, that in Colombia I was part of the majority. Here I am part of a minority, so I learned all the political correctness over 30 years, traditionally underrepresented groups and minorities and all of that. So when I came to Texas A&M, I have to give credit to an enlightenment that I received by our Vice President of Diversity. I am currently the chair of the President's Council on Climate and Diversity. And it is not a numbers game. And it is not adding more because we have less, or adding this one because we don't have that one. The fundamental pillars, going back to your question, and what can we do in a profession, I think can be summarized in three things. One, yes, equity is important, but a lot of people confuse equity with equality, and the best way to describe that is you have all seen the barrier looking at baseball of a short, middle, and tall person, and equalities, all of them on the same length, same height. That's equity is different heights, so everybody can see of that. But where I subscribe is the fact that we need to get rid of the barriers, and the barriers is what leads to justice and equality and equity all at the same time. So why is there a fence that prevents us from seeing baseball? So in architecture, that's part of the problem. We have a lot of artificial barriers that have been just constructed historically. There are a lot of implicit biases that have been just nurtured by systems that are obsolete. So what we have been trying to do is three things. One, it's about climate. If you are in an office or you're in a profession where the climate is not welcoming of people that look different, think differently, are different, then obviously somebody's going to get excluded. Second, it's about equity in the sense of trying to level the playing field. For me, it's not leveling the playing field, it's getting rid of the barriers around it. And the last one, which has made a difference, is accountability. I think that one of the things that is happening these days is that finally people are being accountable for some of the actions or some things that you didn't even realize you did 20 years ago. So I think that when you look at the diversity of a profession, it's about inclusion, it's about climate, it's about equity, and it's about accountability. And only when we become accountable, and in our college we are being held accountable year after year after year. And I have to give you a very small anecdote. The first time that accountability data came in the College of Architecture at A&M, I had to actually stand up and say, our numbers suck. And then I sat down because they were so bad compared to other colleges. In 5 years, we were able to change that, and we became going up. So it requires a continuous effort, but it requires looking at the opportunity rather than seeing the problems and trying to correct it.
I'd like to continue the discussion of diversity a little bit, but a little bit differently. Texas is a border state, and you were discussing walls. Well, we have a wall between us and our southern border, and that's once an architectural problem, a landscape problem, and a political problem. So I'm just wondering how you all are addressing this as educators, both academically, but also if it's the immigration policy is affecting your student body. I know, is it affecting the applications from abroad, your bottom line? A number of students you're able to accept or would like to accept, and there's that's a lot of questions.
So I might start with if you don't mind. Texas Tech, for those of you that don't know, has a campus in El Paso. It's a fairly robust but small program of about 60 students. Almost every one of the students Hispanic. There may be one Caucasian in the student body. We have students every day cross the border to study at Texas Tech at our facility there. So your question actually affects me and affects my college very, very directly. If the border is shut down as it is now being threatened to happen, my students won't be able to go to college. They won't be able to go to school. So for us, this issue is very real and very, very problematic. It sends a message to my students, whether they are coming across the border or not, that they are not welcome. People of their color are not welcome. And this is a real problem.
May I say that what brought me to Texas was a program called the Colonias. The Colonias program is a legislative mandate of the state of Texas that ended up at Texas A&M, and I came here to work in that program. For me, this is more than real. We have 42 community centers from El Paso all the way down to Brownsville, and we deal with the realities of people, infants, children, young adults, senior citizens, whose principal crime is wanting dignity, wanting opportunities. We connect them with Health and Human Services. We can do all that, and basically that is part of the fabric of our college, our land-grant university mission, and they are part of who we are. On this side of the border, I don't use the word wall because the wall does not exist yet. And there are many parts where there is still fluidity in terms of movement. But the reality is that when you start putting faces to this, it stops being a political problem. It becomes a humanitarian problem. And for me, to see a population of people whose only, crime is wanting to have a better life. And these are people that were born in this country, people that are citizens of this country, demonized by a complete false narrative. It touches a real thing. So our college has risen to the occasion of dealing like we do in Aguiland. It's through selfless service, and what we do with them takes a whole life of our own. And we take studios, we bring them. It's a matter of really, again, going back to the fundamental of what architecture is all about, and that's about people. The three things that we do is quality of life for people, no matter what you define that to be. It's quality of place where people are, whether it's the built environment, the natural environment, or even the virtual environment. And the last thing is what people do in a place. So it's all the verbs that we know: pray, play, buy, live, work, whatever it is, heal. And that's how we are shaping a difference on approaches. It's not just a curricular issue. It's not just accreditation issue. It's not just, something that doesn't happen to us because it touches all of us. We have DACA students. We have a mandate of program abroad. Many of our students are not able to do that. So it's a complicated issue. And it's one of those that some people don't like to talk about it because it's not that clear.
It also raises a really deep architectural question around ethics and the ethics of architectural practice, which I think we really have a duty as educators to start exploring thoroughly with our students and with one another as researchers, thinkers and practitioners. And there's been two sort of responses at large within the profession around the whole issue of immigration and immigration centres where people are processed and so on and so forth. One of the positions is to just boycott designing those facilities. And the argument there is that the premise of trying to be involved in designing more humane centres relies upon the idea that the system is broken, and therefore coming in as an architect and trying to design a more humane centre ipso facto means that you're going to somehow fix the broken system. But the system is working the way it was set up to work. That's one side. So that argument is basically the resistance model, right? The other argument is no, architects today can't afford to abdicate their social responsibility. And we're involved in the practice of, as you've pointed out, designing spaces that are meant to be humane. And if we don't engage with this, they're going to be designed anyway. So we've got a position of strength that we can engage in by trying to encourage more humane environments with more natural lighting, ventilation, humane, dignified spaces, and not under a bridge in El Paso. Now they've been moved to a parking lot in tents today. So those are the two positions. I tend, in my own sort of theoretical work, to want to have my cake and eat it with those positions, because I think in many ways when you strike a firm position like that, it often ends up being co-opted in some way. And in my view, the way the system works is through co-optation. And I think as architects, practitioners and theorists, and architectural discourse as a whole, we need to be much more nimble and to think of ways in which we can, at times resist, boycott, and then other times engage and do so strategically so that we move between those to come up with the most effective solutions. And I think that kind of discourse and those kinds of experiments are really well placed to occur within an academic setting, right? Especially when we've got a really diverse student population. We've got other kinds of resources. We've got these sorts of opportunities to talk with one another and brainstorm different ways of thinking about this problem. But it's fundamentally an ethical problem. And I probably would slightly differ to you, Jorge, on this, because for me, any ethical problem is inherently a political problem. Architectural practice occurs within the context of social, economic, political and environmental forces, and as a practice that's inherently kind of imbued in those forces, it's always going to be political in some shape or form. If you're organising or creating spaces, as you do so, the discussion around who's excluded and who's included and how is always one that we should ethically be asking of ourselves.
I'm going to take this in a different direction and talk about it from the standpoint of how it can push back on the very way that we define our discipline and our profession. So much of what we do as we deal with the built environment is property-driven, ownership and property-driven. What we draw a boundary around, what we encircle, what we decide is within that, what we decide is not part of that. This is an issue that sort of pushes on that very idea of ownership and property. And if we start thinking about the things that we have to be dealing with, that we have to be confronting within this century, beginning with the question of water, your area, beginning with, my area, which has to do with climate change and things like that, we don't get to say this occurs north of the border and it doesn't occur south of the border, or vice versa. These are things that sort of are systems, jurisdictions, whether they're natural systems, whether they're physical systems, whether they're infrastructural systems, that sort of defy what we might define as a property, a jurisdictional type of line. And I think for too long, our discipline has sort of circumscribed what it has done by the line, by the property line. And if we begin to sort of understand instead that each one of these different systems has a different footprint, a different domain, who we're in partnership with, who we're in communication with. And I know we're not supposed to talk about our schools, but we're all talking about our schools. So I just
We're not.
yeah, well, but that was the instructions that I received on this. But I'm just going to say a little something, and I think this is what might what I hope is an incredible opportunity for our state, and it certainly is for our university. We're a Mexican institution as well. There are two institutions in the United States that are also considered nonprofits within Mexico, which makes us eligible for funding from the Mexican government. So what's happened in this last year is the amount of work that we're doing in Mexico has increased substantially. So at the same time, there's been a talk of this sort of, splitting apart and this decoupling. At the same time, we're seeing more students from Mexico, particularly Fulbright scholars, particularly PhD students and advanced scholars coming from Mexico at an unprecedented rate than we've dealt with before. So I think that for us, we're really interested in embracing what it is that we can do in partnership on some of these major problems that we can't do it on our own. We can't do it as a single state, but we can do it if we begin to sort of collaborate in the right kind of way. So it's something as well that if we look at it for the opportunity for pushing back on how we normatively define our discipline, I think we need to look at it that way as well.
One of the things that we're all bound by the fact that we're Texans, or adopted Texans, but this is such an enormous state that leaves a great still deal of diversity between us and our locations and everything about us. So I was just wondering, and there's between the four institutions that you represent, they're from four dramatically different places, landscapes, regions of this great state. So I thought maybe you could talk just briefly, each of you, about the biggest challenge that you're seeing in the architectural environment where you are, and also what you're trying to do to sort of alleviate it. I know in this region, I think we have equity of, I think everywhere there are issues of equity and transit, et cetera. But I'm just wondering, for each of you, because their landscapes are so different, we could talk a little bit about your individual situations and some of the unique things that you're doing.
I guess we're rotating. Austin, the rate of growth at Austin is astonishing. And I think it's almost unprecedented what we're dealing with in comparison to any other city in the United States, what we're dealing with. It's a type of thing that it's an incredibly exciting time to be in Austin. It's a terrifying time to be in Austin, and realizing that the very thing that we have all sort of made our professions and our careers is precisely the thing that is not working in terms of planning for the future growth of Austin. If we think about our set of professions, the time frames that we work in, the length of time that we think about, we build for 20 years, we build for 30 years, we build for 50 years. Instead, we're being confronted with a city that is changing daily. I photograph from my terrace every week to see a new skyline almost every week on this. How we've thought, how we've designed cities isn't relevant anymore within that. The changes are happening faster than we can plan. They're happening faster than the type of knowledge that we have embedded can be made manifest on that. And I think it's forcing us as well to have to rethink what we consider to be the armature of what we make, what we consider to be the permanence of what we make. That we used to think that it was the fabric of the city, that it was the physical buildings of the city that created that permanent fabric. That fabric is changing overnight. So what is the actual sort of armature of the city? Is it a different kind of infrastructure? Does it need to be water? You know, do we need to actually rethink, as I think we probably do, much of Central Texas in terms of understanding what the water systems are? That becomes our new fabric, and the buildings themselves end up being the more ephemeral parts of it. I think we're really being pushed on this, and that we've reached this point that however we've thought about traffic, however we thought about infrastructure, however we thought about energy, water, construction, and equity, those ways aren't working for us anymore. And it's really time for us to start questioning what it is we privilege, what it is we make, how it is that we're going to design for the future.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because it highlights the need to sort of take a systems approach to the way in which we're thinking about our cities and how we deal with, say, climate change, how we deal with housing affordability. I mean, for example, here in Dallas, I was reading a report that we're 20,000 units short. And there's an initiative here in Dallas to try to build those 20,000 affordable units for folks. But, you know, when you were talking about land values, for example, here the average price of a home, the median price is, depending on what statistics you look at, is between $215,000 and $250,000. But if you have a mortgage for 30 years to pay for a $250,000 home, you need to be earning at least $60,000 a year. But 28% people living in Dallas earn the household earns under $25,000 a year. So we've got a real problem here around housing affordability and the number of homes that are available for low-income folks, which also then drives, you know, homelessness issues here in Dallas. Homelessness here increased 9% between 1 year and the year before.
These are all the questions I'm about to ask. You're really killing me here.
Sorry, Mark. And then to sort of look over to water, and I want to pick up on that point. You know, with climate change, one of the things I was looking at sort of the numbers of the fourth climate assessment report has now come out. And, you know, scientists from 13...
All right, no, wait a second. We're going to wait. We're going to get to climate in a few minutes.
Are you not going to let me talk about climate?
I'm going to...
But this is a systems way of thinking, though.
We have a special section
interrelated,
on climate.
but you're going to make me box
eat
them
up
up
all
into
my questions.
separate places. All right.
We're going to get
I'll
to climate.
pass it on to
We're
Jorge.
going to get to
I
climate.
won't talk about climate.
Climate is next.
You let Michelle talk about climate. It's all right. We'll pass it on.
I'm going to get fired.
So when you look at Texas, and it's big, one thing that struck me is the following, and I'm not sure how solid the statistic is. How many municipalities and towns are there in Texas? And there was one source that I saw that said that there were 4,400 when we're talking the small and everything. So I would challenge all of you to name the top 50 cities in Texas. And I think that all of us would have trouble coming up with a list of 50, right? Even 25. That's the usual suspects come out. So the question for us has been, as a land grant, sea grant, space grant institution, what is our scope and our reach? I can tell you that we cannot compete against Arlington because you're in an urban area. We cannot compete against Austin in an urban area. Even in Lubbock, you're much bigger than Bryan College Station. So for us, we tend to have a distributed opportunity and presence, and we have two programs that are doing that. So when you look at what we bring to the table, I want to really piggyback on something that Michelle said. There is nobody that has the answer anymore. There is no discipline that has the answer anymore. There's not public or private institution or organization that has the answer anymore. But all of us do have it if we learn how to play nice with each other. So in what we have tried to do, is not break the silos, because the silos are absolutely necessary. We are trying to expose our students to the realities of everything, from urban to the most rural parts of Texas. And no, we cannot take all of them, because there are a lot. But we have, beyond Texas, a mandatory semester away that's international, and I think we all have international programs. So I think that the answer is really, what do you want to be the scope, temporally and spatially, of where you want to target what we have the power to do? And it's multi, inter, cross, transdisciplinary in many ways. And for us, it's about planners working with landscape, working with architects, working with land development, working with construction, working with facility management. So that's where I see the future going. If we were able to solve an urban problem in a very small town, it's going to be hard to move Dallas. It's going to be hard to move Houston. It's going to be hard to move Austin. But imagine 3,000 smaller size sustainable communities, what they would do for a state like this one. So I think it's a matter of changing a little bit the perspective on where is our target.
Well, how better can your programs serve the community within which you're placed? How better can your programs serve the communities within which you're placed? Yeah. And that also means getting students out of the classroom and into, for us, into the city, you know, whether it's through design build programs, doing affordable housing and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I know this will come as a surprise to everyone, but Lubbock is not a place where the skyline changes on a daily basis. Much as we might like it to. The skyline hasn't changed since the tornado hit the downtown area in 1970. That's not an exaggeration. Our challenges are different. And I think our challenges are more widespread than one might imagine, and this may relate to what you were just talking about. We're in a unique situation where the rural and the urban abut each other in remarkably short distance. So you can drive outside of downtown Lubbock, and after a mile, you're in the rural. And so that creates a particularly unique dynamic and a particularly unique set of challenges. The city would like to grow, but it has difficulty growing. It is incredibly, intensely rooted in an agricultural system that is probably where some of its most interesting attributes lie, in terms of thinking about the place as not a city, but as a hub. They call it the hub city, as a hub of any number of agricultural systems. And that gives it a kind of unique sense of place and again, a unique set of challenges. The other thing is that it also has grown a particularly interesting, resilient culture that is stubbornly adhering to its qualities. And that can sometimes be aggravating, but it's actually, in the end, an asset. It gives the place identity in a time when very few urban situations in the United States could actually claim that they have an identity. And so to try to link, we've got international programs. We're trying to be more and more global. The colleges, making enormous efforts in that regard. But we have to constantly balance it with this interesting identity and location within a complex set of systems which are almost invisible, but are there. And
congratulations on making the Final Four. Yes, Texas Tech. Big fan there.
You don't think it's just going to be the Final Four, do you?
So think architecturally, UVA might be the favorite architecturally if you of the final four teams. But I'll root for your team. But as promised, now let's return to the issues of climate and related sustainability and resilience, which are so critical at the moment. And I would just interested in how you're approaching this pedagogically, and especially in a state where climate change is not necessarily accepted science, and in fact can be politically dangerous, perhaps, given some of the funding and governmental sources you rely on.
So resilience and sustainability have been cornerstones since I became dean in 2008, and it was a legacy from a few years back. We incorporate that in everything we do, from the master plan of the university to curriculum to pedagogy to everything is around there. We are lucky that we have centers of research that focus on those issues, sustainable communities, hazard reduction and recovery. And what we have learned is that to avoid some of the pushback, you don't focus on trying to convince people that climate change is or science is, because you know that they're going to just zero out. So we focus on the effects that are very visible of floods in Houston, the effects of very visible of a drought or fires like we had in Bastrop or anything like that. And we focus on the effect on people like that. And we are responding by creating a culture within the students that through what we do in research, through what we do in teaching, we are living to our mandate, like I said before, of land grant. But for us, everything we do is reflected on those pillars of that. And health is another one. And health is integral to sustainability. It's integral to people. So I think that it's redefining a little bit of not, I think you were saying, not boxes and how the boxes add to more boxes, but rather what are the themes that relate. I was very lucky to participate with UT and 11 other institutions on a National Science Foundation grant, creating a consortium on sustainability for South Texas. And it was very rewarding that when we were talking about what we were trying to do, it didn't matter if it was UT, it didn't matter if it was the Southwest Research Institute, it didn't matter if it was A&M. We were there because of what we were hoping to deliver as outcomes. So for us, it's an integral part of our DNA.
This is an area where I will offend some people, and oddly enough, it's because I don't want to offend people that I'm offending people. I don't think about it as a political issue. I don't think about it as a belief issue. I'm just figuring out what the path is that gets us results, and I will talk to whomever I need to talk to, in whatever way I need to talk to them, in order to sort of find what that path forward is that does the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And it's been interesting. One of the reasons I came to Texas was I was tired of being in an echo chamber where everybody thought like me. Everybody responded to things in the same way I did. I wanted to be in the middle of the debate and the discussion, and being in the Capitol means that I get to do that. And I've been fascinated, and I have learned so much in meeting with people from all sides, all points of view, because I think there's actually a lot more common ground in moving forward when we begin to sort of focus on what steps we have to take in the future. Now, the part that I think I'm going to distress people on is that I do feel that as a set of professions, and it might be sort of the very nature, particularly of architecture, that this is so, we produce things. You know, we deliver a product at the end. And that product is a solution for many different things. We so want there to be solutions. You know, the fact that we call something sustainable indicates that it's already got a solution embedded in the very name sustainable. And I'm going to just sort of like hearken back to Grow Harlem Brundtland. And if you don't know Grow Harlem Brundtland, and you should, she was the former Prime Minister of Norway who ran the Brundtland Commission in 1983 to define sustainability. The term that we use today was defined by her commission. When they defined sustainability, it wasn't about a sustainable product, it wasn't about a sustainable building, it wasn't about a sustainable city, it wasn't about a sustainable state or a country. It was understanding that the balance had to occur between the environmental consequences created by the developed world and the dire human needs of a developing world. That sustainability was when you were balancing out in the developing world, not when in your developed area for your thing, your product, for your children. That's not what they were talking about. They were really thinking about this balance all the way across the world. And we have always thought in architecture about the sustainable building, the product at the end of it. There are not heroic solutions. And you can't think about sustainability by truncating it in that particular way, truncating it by a property boundary. And we come back to the idea of the property boundary and saying, I've drawn a circle, I sort of balanced around that. That's good enough because I worried about my piece without thinking about those consequences far beyond our purview and our realm. I think we're stunningly unprepared for climate change. And I think that we're a set of professions and disciplines that have enormous responsibility for our contributions negatively to climate change. And we've got to start taking some very aggressive action within ourselves. I think it's not about sort of convincing a public, convincing politicians. I think we first of all have to convince ourselves that we have to start making some radical changes in how we think about moving forward.
One thing that might describe West Texas is its dependence upon any number of economies that are based upon extraction, and how those economies of extraction contribute to any number of important issues, sustainability, climate change being one of them, maybe directly, sometimes indirectly. Architecture's role in this, in our recognition, understanding that I'm just going to follow on what Michelle is saying, our understanding that the consequences of what we do have effects so far down the line that we don't recognize, but I would say that we don't choose to recognize, and that we don't choose to understand our willing ignorance in the face of many of these challenges. Climate change would be one. There are issues in West Texas West Texas is an agricultural economy. It will be hard hit when climate change occurs. We are extracting enormous amounts of water from the underlying aquifer that will not be able to be replenished. Those are just two examples of how the place I'm in participates in issues with the hope that somehow they will be solved, and the hope that we will somehow find a magic bullet. And unfortunately, I think there is no magic bullet. It's going to take a reconfiguration of our discipline to really begin to address it, and to recognize, I think, just again following Michelle, that this is not a problem isolated to Texas. It's not a problem isolated to a particular city. It's not a problem that a border somehow stops. These things are intricately involved with each other, and we've got to start recognizing that. We have to start to recognize that you build a wall out of a particular material, it has effects globally. It has negative effects often globally. There's an ethos about architectural practice that I think we need to be talking about. An ethos and a consciousness that we absolutely have to begin to start talking about and acknowledging and participating in its change.
So to pick up on the point of an ethos, and you've also alluded to sort of striking common ground and, you know, the importance to think critically about the way in which our current system is driven by property relations, which inherently mean that we circumscribe things with boundaries that are often artificial, especially when we look at water streams and whatnot, because they don't, they don't follow those kinds of boundaries. And then you started the question with, you know, in a state where it's often a prickly question to kind of have a position openly about where you are on climate change. I don't care that I'm in Texas. I'm just going to say for the record, I don't believe in climate change. I trust climate change science. It's not a problem of belief. There is hardcore science that's been accumulated over the years, and I think we have to be bold and brave enough to say that's where we stand, but that doesn't preclude us trying to find common ground with folks that might still be skeptical about the science. I also think when you're sort of talking about an ethos and that's sort of driving architectural practice and thinking, so much of the discussion is around, you know, designing buildings for people and spaces for people, and it's not to say that we shouldn't be thinking like that, but it's such an anthropocentric way of thinking about the practice and the way in which we think about our built environment. Our built environment is a habitat for many other species, not just human beings. So I think there's a need for us to think in a sort of a trans-speciesist way, in a transgenerational way, thinking about generations that have not yet been born, as well as what you alluded to, you know, in a transnational way, beyond boundaries. So the trans in architectural practice, I think we need to try to figure out ways in which we can invoke that in meaningful ways in order to move beyond the anthropocentric framing of what we do.
Well, one other thing though is maybe to return it the question to the four of us. We in colleges of architecture play a really significant role in it, trying to establish this a different ethos. Whether it is who we hire, how we hire, what research we support, what problems we define, how we frame the notion of architecture for a new generation of students. These are all things that we have the capacity to do within our colleges. I hope we can talk about architectural design at some point, but because that would be important too. I think it plays a really critical, absolute critical role. But to understand that we have the ability to expose students and to support research agendas that can address these problems, that's a very critical thing that we can do.
Well, I think we're going to have to move on to the lightning round. Maybe we'll get to some form. But I'd like to start with another issue that you raised, Adrian, which is housing. We have a housing crisis. We have a homelessness crisis in Dallas and around Texas and around the nation. So my first question is this actually an architectural problem? And second, what can architecture and what can architectural schools do about it? Schools, or what can our institutions do about it?
Well, our school is got a great design build program, and every year we're building one affordable home for a low-income family. and then they can buy that at below market rate. So that's a very sort of direct, tangible thing, and I'm very committed to building that program out, no pun intended, moving forward, because I think there's lots of potential there. They're exploring, other kinds of housing, like tiny houses and so on and so forth. So I do think architects have a very important role to play in that. But I also think that it has to be in conversation with policymakers and, zoning for areas in the city for affordable housing. The majority of housing that's still going up in Dallas, for example, is high income homes, right? So these sorts of things have to come back to policymakers. I also think that getting students out into the city to do empirical research in sort of mapping these kinds of inequities can provide communities with very real tangible tools to help them go to policymakers and to the leaders in their community, and it enables them to sort of articulate some of these dynamics of inequity, and I think architecture schools have a role to play in that in a really tangible way. And of course, other forms of research that we do and how we can contribute to shifting the discussion and in turn perhaps influencing policy moving forward. The co-op and collective housing movement that's occurring over on the West Coast is certainly something that architects can be more actively involved with, experimenting with some of those models. There's some really interesting models happening in San Francisco for homeless people, where they're now, instead of just sort of designing shelters, they're creating spaces where they've recognized that homeless people tend to create friendships that they stay with, and some of the models in San Francisco allow that as a community to come together and live together in some of the homes that have been designed there, including their pets, and providing them with the sorts of social services that they need to help on-ramp them into having a home. So I think there's lots of things that designers can be involved with in a positive way to help solving this problem.
I would say that I want to pick up on something that Michelle said. I think that you hit it right on the nail from my perspective. If you look at affordable housing as a product, you're never going to solve it, period. Because, I come from a country that affordable housing is called vivienda de interés social, social interest homes. There, solving the affordable housing problem is developing a house that's 4 meters by 4 meters and give it to a starter family. They have tried everything, subsidies, everything. So it's a wicked problem that keeps on changing. But if we have the mentality that architecture is going to provide a solution to affordable housing, I think it's a wrong thing. And if you go back to the Brundtland Commission, they never mention products. It's the ability of us to solve our problems, whatever they may be, in whatever way we can, without compromising, like you were saying, the longer term ability to solve those problems, but not with solutions that are widgets, houses, tiny houses, whatever it may be. So what we need, what we are doing, is trying to get the future professionals, and for us, the licensure is only at the master's level. But the environmental design 4+2 and other things, it's about the urban planning angle. You cannot have affordable housing without a planning perspective, a planning and design perspective at an urban, suburban scale. You can't have it without economics and financial. You cannot have it without technological. You cannot have it without discussing workforce. So I think that I have learned in one institute of wicked problems that the only way to solve a wicked problem is not to solve it, but rather learn how to manage it. And I think that's where we have failed, because every country that I have been that has affordable housing policies, plans, and everything, what they fail is because they don't manage those type of things. There have been infusions of technology. Anybody remember Operation Breakthrough in the 70s? Where they wanted to capitalize on the industrial massive complex to produce housing, and it was a total flop and failure. So it was not a matter of technology. It's not a matter that we cannot build or 3D print. I mean, they're doing it in Austin, $4,000 home, 3D printed 24 hours. So why aren't we solving the problem is because the solution requires a different ethos, mentality, paradigm, and a level of collaboration that transcends monodisciplinary approaches into the truly pluridisciplinary. And that's what I think.
I'm going to sort of reframe this slightly. I think housing is absolutely an architectural problem. I just don't think the solution is a building problem. And I think that's perhaps where we've gone awry on that is we keep wanting to sort of like solve it by the perfect design of the right kind of buildings within that. And I think that actually sort of is short shrift on what it is that we do as architects and what we can actually contribute as architects. This morning, I spoke to the mayor of Austin City Council and news cameras that I was not expecting to be there about planning that we're doing for the city. And I said, what we bring to the table as a school of architecture is the fact that, you know, it's the way that we do design thinking. It's the different types of domains that come into play. It's the different types of knowledge that we deal with. That we're always, design thinking within our field is not about creative brainstorming. You know, it's not that. What it is, it's about making decisions between groups of sort of like sometimes intractable and difficult problems that, you know, what I might be dealing with in terms of the cultural identity of a neighborhood versus particulate distribution coming from diesel trucks. We're always having to sort of like compare, weigh, pass judgment, and go through that. And so what I was explaining to the city, what we can bring to the city is a set of tools, scenarios, the types of sort of like questions, the types of domains that come into play. That's what architects can do in terms of helping the city solve problems that may not be solved by making a building on this. And I also sort of, just as a slight anecdote on this, many years ago, after the first Asian tsunami, a group of students at Harvard came to me and really wanted to do something about it. And we raised some funds. We designed the perfect housing solution for it, brought it to Sri Lanka, and were told that the one thing they didn't need were any more architects showing up, trying to sort of build more housing for them. That was the one thing they were fairly resilient at. What they wanted were people who could rethink their infrastructure, who could understand how industry was going to be rebuilt again. That's what they really needed from us.
So last night, Gabriela Carrillo was lecturing in Lubbock, and at the dinner table, you know, she was talking about Mexico City and earthquakes, and meetings with architects immediately after the earthquake, the night after the earthquake, trying to figure out what they could do. And in the end, her conclusion was, in an emergency, architects can't do anything. That's not our role. I'm gonna take a risk here. I'm bothered by the problem-solve problem, or how it is actually framed. When we start talking about it as it's a housing problem, we have to solve the housing problem, I think we've missed the boat. I think we've undercut our own creative capacities, and I think we've boxed ourselves into a place that we really can't offer that much.
I don't know. I'm going to push back just a little bit because I understand what you're saying, but at the same time, there are some very real, concrete challenges that we're all kind of having to deal with in our respective professions, chosen areas. And if we can recognize, like, I personally think that there are three dominant conditions that that's informing our existence. One of them is inequity, and that relates to housing affordability, but also other issues. The second one is climate change that we've talked about. And the third elephant in the room is militarism, right? And the way in which spaces are being continually militarized. And I think if we're going to sort of think about these things in tandem, because I don't think we can extract them from one another, we also need to be able to recognize that, and if we go back to your point about, property values and so on and so forth, David Harvey wrote a really interesting essay on the right to the city. And I think what architects also help facilitate is our right to the city. And the right to the city is the right to create the city and to create the city on our own terms in some shape or form. So yes, it does mean sort of being able to have influence over, governments and providing sort of policymakers with certain sort of systems and strategies, but also how do we as designers or design thinkers engage the communities with which, we live with and who are being affected by this. And I think design is also actively involved in doing that as well. But part of that means being able to recognize certain problems as they appear with some sort of critical realism so that we've got some stickiness with the way in which we work and we don't slide around the problem.
I don't know how much, I certainly think architects can be involved in climate change. We've talked about this. I certainly think that we have a role in problems of equity. I think all of the three things that you've mentioned, we play lesser or greater roles in. But I think that there is a kind of thing that is missing when we talk about these as problems that architects have to solve, and that is our ability to speculate about the place of human beings, which involves all these things. But if we narrow it to a kind of set of problems, and all we do is channel our energies towards those, I think the larger picture gets lost. I would add to your three issues a problem of identity, a problem of belonging. And I don't mean identity politics in the way it's occurring now. That's not what I'm talking about.
I think the appeal to identity has ended up with a fairly divisive country. But belonging, I'm with you on. Yeah.
Well, perhaps I mean that, because the identity politics and architecture has certainly played a role in identity politics, sometimes in horrible ways. But I mean a kind of sense of belonging, a kind of sense, going back to some of the earlier things we talked about, a sense of place. If we remove the way that we can speculate about that from the problems to be solved, I think we've made a mistake.
I just don't think, sorry, Jorge, I think we're not that different then, because what I'm suggesting is that problems don't necessarily box you in. I think being able to clearly articulate a problem is a really important skill, and it's one that can open up all kinds of other possibilities and other ways of thinking about a challenging situation. And I do think it's not necessarily something that's limiting. It's actually a space of opportunity.
So there is, just to very quickly, there's an analogy here. Are we educating or training or problems? I totally agree with the problem-solving problem. So if you look at lifelong learning as one of the outcomes that we are all, what do we got in our students? To be lifelong learners. Anything that we teach them in 4 years may be obsolete the next year. So I think that by trying to parse a problem into nice little boundaries and solve it may not be the best way to go. And to create a lifelong learner, you want to really build on what architects are good at, and I agree, but both of you are saying important things. So it's the attributes of what we bring to the world. There was one saying in one wall that I always remember, that it's not about the world of design. Design as an object, design something that we produce, but it's about the design of the world, which goes back to what are the outcomes that we want. So I think that both positions are extremely reconcilable.
I think my idea for a lightning round was a complete fail. Where
Too much problematizing going on.
The problem was not well articulated.
Was that a verb
Sorry.
or was that problem as a noun?
that was a really bad burn. You watch it. We're 20 minutes past where we're supposed to be. So I think this was a really fun panel. Adrian, you were fantastic.
I paid him to say that.
You are.
I know. No pun intended.
And no, I thought it was really revealing. I thought the idea, I think that we're looking at 4 institutions with leaders who are looking at architecture as much more than a siloed practice is the thing I'm going to take away. And thank you so much for sitting through my failed moderation. And thank you especially for coming out to hear about what's happening in our field. It's really exciting, and I really appreciate it. And the enthusiasm for architecture. It's so exciting to see so many people in Dallas caring about our built city. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.